Hello, my name is Renata Piątkowska. I am a chief curator of the collection at the POLIN Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you at the session Museums and Art for Critical Change. And first, I would like to introduce our panelists, but unfortunately I would like to say that Dr. Mikhail Gnedovsky couldn't be with us today. So it is one presentation is missing. So we have three panelists and one discussant. It would be quite short presentation. Dr. Katarzyna Muthesius-Murawska teaches art history at the Birkbeck College, University of London. Before her arrival in the United Kingdom, she was curator of Italian paintings and chief curator of the National Museum in Warsaw. And she returned to the museum as its deputy director between 2009 and 2011. She is recipient of a lot of fellowships, and she lectures in various universities and art institutions in Europe and the United States. Her publications include Europäische Malerei am National Museum Warsaw, Triumfo Barocco, Borders in Art, Revisiting Kunst Geography, National Museum in Warsaw Guide, Galleries and Study Collections, with Dorota Folga-Januszewska, Jan Matejko, Battles of Grunwald, New Approaches, and Kantor was here, Tadeusz Kantor in Great Britain, with Natalia Zarzecka, and last, from Museum Critique to the Critical Museum, co-edited with Piotr Piotrowski. Her current research is on caricature and modernity. Professor Ciraj Rassool is professor in the Department of History at the University of the Western Cape, where he also directs the African program in Museum and Heritage Studies. He has served on the board of the District 6 Museum, Itiko Museum of South Africa, the South African Heritage Resources Agency, and the Heritage Council of South Africa. He is also a past chairperson of the Scientific Committee of the International Council of African Museums. He is the co-author and co-editor of several books about museums, heritage, and public culture, including Skeletons in the Cupboard, South Africa Museums and the Trade in Human Remains, Recalling Community in Cape Town, Creating and Curating the District 6 Museum, Museum Frictions, Public Cultures, Global Transformations, and the last one, The Politics of Heritage in Africa, Economies, Histories, and Infrastructures. And our last panelist is Professor Elizabeth Crooke, Professor of Heritage and Museum Studies at Ulster University, where she leads the Engaging the Past Research cluster in the Art and Humanities Research Institute. Crooke has published Museums and Community, Ideas, Issues and Challenges, and Politics, Archaeology, and the creation of a National Museum of Ireland, and recently, Artifacts as Agent for Change, Commemoration and Exchange via Material Culture. Currently, she is working in the areas of community, biography, and material culture, and is co-investigator on the project Living Legacies, 1914-1918, From Past Conflict to Shared Future. Professor Crooke is chairperson of Board of Directors, Northern Ireland Museum Council, and on the Board of Directors of the Irish Museum Association. And Dr. Monica Eileen Patterson is an assistant professor in the Institute of Interdisciplinary Studies and the director of the newly launched program in curatorial studies at Carleton University in Ottawa. She holds a doctorate in anthropology and history and a certificate in museum studies from the University of Michigan. Dr. Patterson is co-editor of Curating Difficult Knowledge, Violent Past in Public Places, and Anthrohistory, Unsettling Knowledge and Questioning Discipline. As a curator, scholar, and activist, she is particularly interested in the intersection of memory, childhood, and violence in post-colonial Africa, and the ways in which they are represented and engaging in contemporary public spheres. So now we have started our session. Our first speaker will be Dr. Katarzyna Muthesius-Murawska, and title of her presentation is The Critical Museum Debates Continue. So please, the floor is yours, and I would like to ask our other panelists to sit.
So, okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing the session, and I'm very pleased that I can be part of this amazing 3 days thinking about museums and the sites of conflict and history. And I would like to present the concept of the critical museum, which was formulated by my colleague Piątkowski when he was nominated the director of the National Museum in Warsaw in 2009, and he stayed as the museum while implementing this idea. And I was his deputy. We stayed in the museum on our posts just over a year, from summer 2009 until the autumn 2010. So in a way, you will hear a lot of terms that were used by today in the morning in the paper, in the keynote presentation by Nelia Diaz. We will hear about forum, about museums as the agent of citizenship. Perhaps the difference is that while MUSEM is the new museum, and many papers in this conference actually tackle new museums which are built from scratch, in a way devised from scratch, in order to prove that the museum as an institution, or try their role as the agent of citizenship. Piotr devised this concept to be applied to the old museum. So how to apply the concept of the critical museum to the museum which has already had 150 years of history, and there were kind of loads of kind of identities which were already invested and associated with this museum. So this is going to be about that, and in a way about our failure. But as the title of my talk suggests, I just hope and I believe that the critical museum, which was initiated by this project, which was aborted, in a way that the debate continues. So the project of the critical museum, the art institution which uses its own resources, including its collections, its range of activities, and its oratic space for encouraging and hosting the debates on the issues that are crucial for contemporary societies, was one of the boldest and socially most significant battles undertaken by Piotr Piotrowski when invited to run the National Museum in Warsaw in 2009. The Critical Museum project was part and parcel of Piotrowski's long-standing campaign against the prevalent discourses of contemporary art history, and in particular, against the hierarchical artistic geography, eulogizing masterpieces and marginalizing the arts non-masterpieces, including the arts of East Central Europe. But it was not just the art historical canon which was the target. Piotrowski's museum was devised first and foremost as a forum, as an active agent in the public sphere, the venue for exhibiting art and discussing society, deliberately contributing to the process of defending democracy and its values, digging up difficult memories, juxtaposing conflicting narratives, entering the street, and in this slide, actually that doesn't show, but you can see this kind of container at the back on the right. This is how that was one exhibition which was posed on the boundary between the museum's yard and the street, aiming to empower the minorities, the immigrants. That was going to happen. They excluded from power. Although the project was aborted, I would argue that the field has been realigned, and the discussion about the Critical Museum continues. The paper will present briefly the origins and the premises, as well as the aftermath of the Critical Museum project. Piotr, who died prematurely in 2015, was professor of art history at the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań, the author of groundbreaking books on Eastern European art, many of them published, translated into English and actually published in England. Indeed, he could be credited with the legitimization of the art of East Central Europe as the object of study at Western universities. While the history of the region belonged to the university curriculum, definitely at least since 1945, its art did not. And it was largely his doing, his books. This is Piotr, obviously the major part in this photograph, the major protagonist of the photograph. His larger-than-life personality, the fervor with which he promoted his ideas, and the way in which he engaged in debates, which helped to realign the field. I was involved in the Critical Museum project through my own research on the visual discourse on East Central Europe, and when Piotr was appointed director of the Warsaw Museum, I agreed to take up post of his deputy. The concept of the Critical Museum, the international debate around it, and the variety of ways in which the idea of the museum forum was or could be realized is tackled in the book we edited together, From Museum Critique to the Critical Museum. Before I actually obscure the face of Gabriel Courage, I just wanted to point out that Gabriel was one of the discussants of the concept. So that's the book, which was published with Ashgate in 2015. Piotr died in May 2015, few days after the book was sent to printers. To summarize the key points of the concept, the Critical Museum aims to embrace and internalize the major points of the museum critique that has been developing since the 1990s, trying to revise its own strategies, consciously and openly countering elitism, nationalism, and colonialism, patriarchalism, xenophobia, homophobia, elitism, and commercialism. The Critical Museum, of course, could be compared to other ideas which have emerged in the museum studies field, such as post-museum or anti-museum. The difference was that the project of the radical transformation was going to be applied not to a history museum, ethnographic museum, or contemporary art gallery, which is about contemporary society anyway, or should be, but to an art museum, so-called Universal Survey Museum, traditionally associated with Temple of Art or a national mausoleum. The project of making the National Museum in Warsaw critical was carried out throughout the very, very turbulent months between August 2009 and October 2010, So in a nutshell, yet again, going through those major issues that we wanted to do, it envisaged a museum which does not just celebrate the artness of art, but uses its collection, its resources, its space, and its authority to respond to the major issues of the contemporary world. It also aims to address the visitor in a non-hierarchical way, involving him or her in the process of construction of meaning, while laying bare the museum's mechanisms and its relation to the hierarchies of mainstream art history. It also stresses the importance of self-critical reflection on the museum's power, recognizing its authority and its potential to transform society. Finally, the museum aims to realign the art geography, empowering the art of East Central Europe and provincializing the West. The major issue is the realization that the museum is the medium, and this could and should be used in such a way as to accomplish the museum's mission towards society, to take part in the debates worth having, paraphrasing Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet's actually contribution to the volume that I have been just showing on the screen, that we published together. Now, I mean, we have been accused while we are doing this project of many things, but one of the issues that arrived very often was that we were imposing the agenda of transformation. By imposing this agenda of transformation, we undermine the position of the museum. There's a kind of profanation that its real identity, which was seen first and foremost as a national institution, which, politically neutral, preserves its collections, displays them, and in this way serves the public, assuming the function of either a pantheon or a temple of art, or, as our Board of Trustees wanted to, an entertainment venue. The survey of the identities inhabited by the Warsaw Museum since 1862, when it was established during the time when Poland was when Poland didn't exist as a country, was occupied by 3 empires. So the survey of identities does not verify this belief that the museum was always a national institution, that it has a fixed identity, which has changed many times. It was established under, and this is this image on top, established under the Tsarist government. The museum was aspiring to the position of the Temple of Beauty, as it is obvious from this gallery of plaster casts, but was a tool of the Tsarist colonizing mission. Actually, it was completely neglected, so it didn't really play any role for those first 50 years of its existence. But the national cause definitely did not belong to its agenda for the first 50 years of its existence. When Poland regained its sovereignty, that will be the image on the top right, there it is. That's the new museum, which was then built. I will come back to it in a second. It rapidly turned this kind of non-museum, or the idea of the museum, it rapidly turned into a large national museum, the Treasure House of Poland, funded by the city. Collecting now all sorts of artworks spanning from the ancient period to early 20th century, from archaeology to applied art, Polish and foreign prints and drawings, of course, paintings, sculptures, coins and medals, as well as photographs. The institution developed into a full-blown universal survey museum, positioning Polish art within the progress of civilization. Its imposing new building, you can see a person contemplating the vastness of this building, finished in 1938 during the last years of the Second Republic of Poland, was standing for its ego ideal. The period of the museum's prosperity came under the directorship of Lorenz, of the director Stanisław Lorenz, that's him, who, and he's actually standing here next to Picasso, if you have not recognized the person. And so he arrived in 1935, staying in the office until 1982. He radically modernized the institution, attracted much larger audiences by waiving the entrance fees and putting a due emphasis on education and promotion, and above all, by establishing good relations with the city of Warsaw. Despite the change of political power after 1945, the radical change, as you realize, the museum continued to develop under Lorenz, who again proved able to utilize the new political system for the sake of his institution, and was in the forefront of all possible battles. The museum was now taken over by the state and given the leading position amongst other museum institutions in Poland. It was officially called the major museum institution in Poland. The decree of the nationalization of private property was used to expand its collections and to add new venues by taking over the nationalized palaces of aristocracy. And it is actually quite interesting, paradoxically, it was the collection of socialist realist works, such as this one by Fangor, it's actually, forget about the author, acquired by the time by the Ministry of Culture and deposited at the museum, which actually forced the museum to change its identity in yet another way by expanding its profile into the contemporary art, which did not belong to this kind of the range of the collections before, and leading to the creation of the first collection of contemporary art. But this is, of course, this is a truth which is silence. Nobody actually wants to remember about that. The end to Lorenz's reign was put by the martial law in 1982, when he was already in his 80s. Since that time, many directors and their deputies, working with various speeds and convictions, have been trying to introduce changes to the monolithic structure of the institution. During all that time, aesthetic choices of the museum, the constant travel between storages, permanent galleries, and exhibition rooms, such as socialist realism and modernism, which kind of swapping place, were firmly imbricated with the political status quo, its pressures, new possibilities, and only occasionally the museum was acting in resistance to power. Mostly the best time that was during actually World War II. Nominally, however, it was silently assumed that the dissemination of aesthetic values, engendering the love of art and thus elevation of the cultural level of the population, was the museum's mission. And this belief is neatly summarized as early as the 1930s by Bronisław Schneider caricatures illustrating a feuilleton published in a Polish satirical journal. And this article and the drawing describes a visit of a petit bourgeois family to the museum just after its grand opening in 1938. The text and the drawing take for granted that the museum takes on the task of regulating the conduct of their visitors, that the museum visit is tantamount to the ritual of initiation, as investigated by Carol Duncan. So museum is free. And as we get from the text, you cannot get it from the drawing, the visitors unprepared, you can see this is vastly kind of, this is not the proper museum body, as it were. I mean, of course, I'm saying that in the quotation marks. I'm not saying that they should be banned from the museum, but this is not a typical kind of, they are not typical museum viewers, this family. So museum is free, but the visitors unprepared for the encounter with art are compelled to buy a guide, which this is in the text, which mediates their viewing process. The guide, actually the guide appears in this next drawing. The guide tells the public what to look at and what to think about it, and crucially, how to behave, or rather, how not to behave. Both the article and the drawing present the National Museum in Warsaw as an exemplary space. I mean, I'm quoting here Tony Bennett, as an exemplary space in which the rough and raucous might learn how to civilize themselves by modeling their conduct on the middle-class codes of behavior to which the museum attendance exposes them. The visitors are not only the seeing subjects, but also the seeing objects. It cannot but internalize the gaze of the museum guard and other museum visitors, which hush and discipline them in all kinds of ways, imposing on them the precise rules of conduct, how to become the proper museum visitor, the art lover, who should be silent and dignified, passive, or at least mildly interested, capable of restraining his or her emotions, slim, elegant, self-aware, and ironically detached. A photograph of Warsaw's intellectual elite at the opening of Janina Konarska exhibition in 1977, many years later, provides a perfect embodiment of the ideal museum visitor, and by and large, the sole addressee of the museum activities since the 1930s, at least as far as the adult viewers are concerned. So we wanted to invite other bodies to the museum. Our major critical project was the exhibition Ars Homoerotica, which coincided with the first Europride event in Warsaw in 2010. The exhibition cast a queering look at the works housed in galleries and magazines of the museum, uncovering a wide range of homoerotic themes and sensibilities ever present in art over the ages from antiquity to the present day. By visualizing the relevance and the continuity of homoerotic representation in the history of art, the exhibition did involve the largest art institution in Poland in the public debate on gay and lesbian rights, thus accomplishing the task of writing a scenario of a possible transformation of this museum. From the moment it was announced, the exhibition was announced, it attracted enormous attention and very diverse reactions from the public as well as from the media of various political orientation, not just in Poland, but over the world from Canada to Russia. And it was reviewed not just in art journals, and which I'm very proud of, but it was written about in newspapers, in just everyday newspapers, so it addressed a different public. To sum up our project and the message, I'm actually finishing, this is my last, I'm getting on the last page. Museums assume neutrality, but they have always served the ruling classes and kept changing their aims and identities alongside the changes in the political systems. Museums do belong to the ideological state apparatuses, interpolating the audiences. They are the instruments of power knowledge, and there is no escape from this identification. They have always been the site of the ritual which forms the citizen or a member of the community, serving as a site for acquisition of cultural capital and social norms. The critical museums lays bare its mission. It consciously takes on the task to provoke, engage, and educate the audiences, to help them negotiate the complexities of contemporary world, the challenges of democracy, and those of living in transnational society. But and this is the crucial thing, in a similar way in which art museums disseminated the canon of beauty in the past, contributed to the process of imaging the nation or imaging a community, they now, and this is the, in a way, the message of the critical museum, their duty is now to have to target chauvinism, homophobia, persecution, and contempt towards refugees and ethnic minorities or any minorities. In the age of critical self-reflection, which embraces all academic disciplines and many institutions, museums should also undertake this task. The debate continues, as I have said, a special issue of Krytyka Polityczna of February 2015, including interviews with the museum curators and their responses to the concept of the critical institution. I keep getting requests from people asking me for articles from the book. On Academia Edu, this is my most successful entry, as it were. Its reviews, such as that by Samuel Rumschlag in Museums and Social Issues, confirm that the ideas of using the cultural authority of the museum to facilitate social discussion, to embrace controversy rather than trying to placate benefactors, museum board of trustees, and appease the public might be sometimes shocking and unorthodox, but they belong to the discussions worth having. The critical museums forms part of a larger struggle for democracy and equality, which has to go on. So, sorry for going over.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Professor Ciraj Rassool, And the title of his presentation is Aesthetics of Commitment. This is question. Forced removals, art and social practice in Cape Town's District 6. Professor, please.
Thank you so much. It's good to be here and to be with colleagues that I've known for a long time. I have just ended a period of 20 years on the board of the District 6 Museum, and in the last period having been the chairperson. And it's interesting to not to have that responsibility in one's life. And I come back every now and then to thinking about the museum because it's such a dynamic space, such an ongoing space. And I've written, as some of you will know, quite a great deal about the work of the museum and the ways in which it has challenged us to rethink what we mean by museum. And of course, there's a whole line of scholarship that has understood the interpretive work of the District 6 Museum in Cape Town as intractably local and concerned with grappling with the complexities of nostalgic memory, even a restorative nostalgia. And some have even understood the work of the District 6 Museum as able to counteract linear grand narratives of the nation through a focus on the quotidian and on embodied memory. Older studies have also tended to emphasize the sense of authenticity and innocence in the work of the District 6 Museum, especially in their relationship to community when compared with the emergence of new narratives of the new nation and new national museums in South Africa. However, I also want to suggest that there's a whole line of scholarship, particularly by staff, trustees of the District 6 Museum, that has emphasized the work of the District 6 Museum as that of a museum of process, a museum of transactions of knowledge based on expertise in a range of fields of research and knowledge production within the museum itself, and has resisted attempts to place the museum's work as simply rooted in community as ordinary experience and in the innocence and authenticity of the local. That the District 6 Museum work indeed has not merely been an engagement with social history of removals, restitution and memory in District 6, but on the contrary, it is an intervention in the production of history itself, in reorienting public history away from the notion of accessible representations of scholarship by experts for ordinary people. So it's also been an intervention in the fields of museum practice and memory work in South Africa and internationally as a post-collecting museum marked by knowledge transactions and engagement about historical and cultural questions. Now, while the museum became one of the only sites in Cape Town with a sense of legitimacy to address the future of the city and its concept of citizenship and to issues of urban renewal and cityness, at moments these debates concern the very categories of museum and exhibition. Where is that? There we go. These debates have concerned the very categories of museum and exhibition itself. And the main curatorial elements of the District 6 Museum's exhibition work, the retrieved street name signs, the growing portrait gallery, the inscribed map painting, and the inscribed calico cloth are at the heart of the inscriptive and performative methods of the museum. Now, the multidisciplinary, transactional, and deliberately friction-laden methods of work and this inscriptive, performative character influenced the processes of collecting, preparation and design of exhibitions, as well as the lives of these exhibitions during their duration, as they were constantly critiqued, interfered with, and updated. And they have also sustained the programs of the District 6 Museum that have shifted from exhibitionary work as one of the key outcomes of its memory work to a focus on infusing issues of memory and memorial into the District 6 land restitution process and onto the District 6 landscape through its hands-on District 6 program. Just very briefly, for those who don't know, District 6 is this very visible, iconic area in the center of Cape Town that experienced a massive process of forced removal under apartheid's Group Areas Act in the 1970s and the early 1980s, so quite recently, and that occurred curiously at the time when apartheid changed its very nature to become much more a program of entering into an alliance with sections of the black middle class. And it resulted in District 6, renamed as Zonnebloem, not really being redeveloped as a white group area. And so it became quite iconic. And I suggested a number of years ago that a community museum wishing to influence the identity-making processes of recreating and redefining a community from the ruins of apartheid's destruction required a strong museum infrastructure and more decisive means of balancing social activism with professional museum skills. And so it is precisely being able to balance these productive tensions between activism and institutionalization, and between the museum as process and the museum as collection and administration, that has been one of the central challenges of the life of the District 6 Museum. These seeming contradictory elements of the formal and the processual, the institutional and the inscriptive, have existed side by side in a complex, creative museum. Now, it's quite interesting that, you'll see this debate in the poster that inaugurated the Streets exhibition in 1994 in the District 6 Museum. You'll see that it had an opening date and you'll see it had a closing date. This was an exhibition that was only meant to last 2 weeks. But when you ask most people, when did the District 6 Museum begin its life, they will tell you that the museum started its life on the 10th of December, 1994, in which you see a slippage from the opening of an exhibition of a museum foundation that became a museum by accident, that where there was never an intention to create a museum as a building, but which was a memory project that became a museum in a building with a permanent exhibition, and that where you have the slippage into an institutionalization and into a professionalized museum space with a collection, a process elsewhere that I've referred to as museumization. And yet, a number of people have been uncomfortable with this idea of that date marking the beginning of the District 6 Museum. And these perspectives point to a longer genealogy of points, of moments of origin, perhaps, of beginnings, of particularly to the cultural societies and debating societies in District 6 in the 1930s and the 1940s that were these spaces of debate over cultural questions and over the major political questions of the day, in which a thwarted black intelligentsia exercised a kind of citizenship in a republic of letters. And in some ways, the work of the District 6 Museum points to that work that was being done in District 6 between the 1930s and the 1950s. But today what I want to do is to talk to you about other kinds of beginnings of the work of the District 6 Museum. And in this paper, I'm concerned with the artists who worked in relation to and sought to depict processes of forced removal in the district in the early 1980s, at the tail end of the removal process. As the last families were dealing with the experience of forced removal in Horsley Street and Rochester Road in District 6 in the early 1980s, Peggy Delport and Sue Williamson, two artists, and Lindy Wilson, a filmmaker, were present in their homes and went on to represent and depict the processes that occurred. So I'm interested here in the work of the artist that is set up as the work of activism. I'm interested in the ethics of activist art that begins with the documentation of suffering, with the documentation of destruction, and the ethics of representation and of visual interpretation, and what happens when the documentation of suffering is turned into artwork, and particularly when that artwork meets the market, and when it meets the Biennale and the international exhibitionary space, and when it meets the international museum that acquires, that purchases the artwork based on these representations. And in this paper, I draw attention to the work of Sue Williamson, famous artist in South Africa, author of the book on resistance art in South Africa, who's done quite a lot of thinking about the act of making an artwork as an act of resistance. And I show how being present in the home of Nazgul Ibrahim in Rochester Road in District 6, in a house Manley Villa, taking photographs of her and her family and of these scenes. Eventually, what Sue Williamson does is that as the removal of this family takes place, in 1981, she opens an exhibition in the Gowlett Gallery on Long Street. In other words, metaphorically, while the blood is still wet. An exhibition called Welcome to the Last Supper opened in the Gowlett Gallery on Long Street in Cape Town, with rubble removed from the sites of demolition in District 6 was piled on the gallery's pristine white floor. It contained broken plates, discarded schoolbooks, wooden beams and window frames, a kitchen sink, chunks of brick and wall with layers of wallpaper. A recorded soundscape made by Williamson played the Adhan of the Muezzin, a song by a wedding singer, scraping, crashing sounds of bulldozers, nostalgic reminiscences and outbursts of anger. The rubble was surrounded by chairs loaned by Naz Ibrahim, used during the last Eid celebration in the previous month. Naz Ibrahim had held this event in her house on the eve of removal, which she called the Last Supper. And she invited people to inscribe messages on the wall of her home. People were asked to put their names onto the wall. And what I'm suggesting here is that one of the arguments that I'm making to you today is that in the very process of removal itself, ex-District 6s were turning their homes into proto-museums with inscriptive methods that later became the hallmark of the work of the District 6 Museum. So it's in the very process of destruction that the museumization, that the museum act, the inscriptive act of museum making began. But what also began was Sue Williamson began a series of exhibitions based on documentation through her connection with Naz Ibrahim, eventually what you have is an appropriation of the experience of suffering into an artwork that eventually finds its way into the collection of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art. And I've been into that collection with the registrar and with one of the curators, where what happened to the elements in this artwork was a process of genericization in which documents of an actual removal process became generalized, and which all the specific detail of the elements of the installation were lost. And of course, what's interesting here is that I think that in this exhibition that happened in the Gowlet Gallery, you have almost the beginnings of installation art in South Africa. I think one of the first installations that took place. Sue Williamson's work, of course, much later on, was put on display at the Havana Biennale and also was turned into a very expensive set of photographic prints printed on hand Mueller paper, including a print of the removal and demolition notice that the family got. And what eventually happens is that that exhibition was called "The Truth is on the Walls," which ironically is also the name of the autobiography that Naz Ibrahim publishes later on. And of course, I was very privileged to experience almost this personal truth and reconciliation moment that Sue Williamson experienced, in which she owned up, she almost confessed to this work that had gone on to the daughters of the late Naz Ibrahim, and showed them all the work that she had done, and eventually donated a set of works to the family. So I worry about the ethics of this work, but in the process of its documentation, I suggest that what it shows is that the museum was being made. The idea of the museum was being formed in the midst of the removal. I contrast the work of Sue Williamson with the activist art of Peggy Delport, which begins with this mural on the wall of the Catholic Church Hall in District 6, which she completed in the last days of the removal. She did this mural, Res Clamant, the earth cries out, documenting scenes of removal, providing a sense of hope here and there. And it is this work, I suggest, that presents a different kind of activist art, one in which she seeks an association and a collaboration with ex-residents and with activists, and that results in her being part of the team that creates the Streets exhibition. And I suggest, indeed, that this is a work of the artist as anonymous, where the artwork is not geared towards the art market. The artwork does not become a collection. It is the artwork as mural. It is the artwork that culminates in the work of the District 6 Museum itself. And quite frankly, she wouldn't want me to say this, but in many ways, the exhibitionary work, the kinds of ideas of process that inform the work of the District 6 Museum are the product of the approaches and the artwork, the collaborative approaches of Peggy Delport herself. And so you have very different approaches by the artist, one that is geared towards the art market, but claiming a political commitment, claiming a position as resistance art, but one that is ethically troubled by an appropriation of social experience. And so you can think about what happens to a chair when it is taken out of a home as the removal is happened and put into the gallery, when it is stripped of its meaning and turned into a display of itself. And of course, this is a whole area of aesthetics that has not really been the subject of much investigation in the work of the District 6 Museum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And our last speaker is Professor Elizabeth Crooke, and the title of her presentation is The Fearful Object. Please.
Good morning, everybody. I think we've just a few minutes left of morning, maybe not. But what I want to talk to you about today is how we deal with the really contested, difficult, and how I'm framing them today is fearful objects that we find in our museum collections. So these are objects that I feel that are very challenging reminders of what humankind is capable of. And I'd like to start with this artefact, and this is an object that is in the archive of the Royal College of Surgeons in Dublin. And I first saw it at a conference in Dublin, and the conference was Incarcerated Bodies, and it was about hunger strikers in Ireland, the history of hunger striking. And the archivist brought this collection of artefacts that would have been used to restrain people on hunger strikes so they could force feed them. And she laid them out on the table for us all to view during the conference. And these are really unpalatable reminders of the physical depths that we'll steep to try and suppress protest. And we can balk at the hardness of the metal. I'll show you a close-up. Thinking of the force necessary to insert the tubes and the methods used to restrain the person all make us feel very uncomfortable. So collectively, in the modern day, in the warmth and relative security of the academic or museum environment, we share our revulsion with our peers. Our feelings are relatively mutual, consensual, and shared. Significantly, if we wish to consider the purpose of knowing the histories of such objects, we do little to interrogate what the historical artefacts mean for contemporary events that we might consider equally sinister. In Falling for Science, Objects in Mind, Sherry Turkle, Professor of Social Studies of Science, tells the story of school experiences of the Jewish scientist Oliver Sacks, moved out of London during the Second World War period. Turkle describes Sacks's memory of mercury coming into contact with aluminium and the chemical reaction causing the protective coating on the aluminium to be removed, resulting in the aluminium dissolving in front of the young scientist. Sacks describes the white fungus that grew until the aluminium was completely eaten up. It made me think of a curse or a spell, the sort of disintegration I sometimes saw in my dreams. That's his words. Turkle reflects that the stresses of the war period took its toll on Sacks. The rotting away of the aluminium evokes the death and carnage of war, the cancer of fascism and anti-Semitism. Mercury in contact with aluminium was, in Turkle's words, the fearful object, that which brought Sacks in contact with his worst fears. So for me, reading her writing, the phrase fearful object is captivating. And I think it can be developed further to explain the responses to material culture people find difficult or impossible to engage with. So when I think of the fearful object, I'm trying to go beyond dark material culture, which could be thought of as the objects of dark tourism, or that which is chilling and people are attracted to in maybe a voyeuristic sense. I'm also thinking of it as something different, to those objects associated with histories which might be difficult to come to terms with, such as the Holocaust, or even a medical instrument like this. Rather, the fearful object is one we are afraid of because it extends a challenge or threat today. The object that, as in Sachs' experience, puts us into contact with our worst fears. So in this paper, I want to think a little about the practice in museums that avoids the fearful histories associated with our collections. It argues that although there are examples of museums including and interpreting such artefacts in their galleries, the truly difficult histories associated with the objects is often bypassed for an interpretation that avoids the complexity of the contested significance of those objects in contemporary society. And I feel the paper links a little bit to a question asked by Dominique Bouchard in one of our sessions here, where she talked about this very scientific interpretation of objects that we see in our galleries, where we just put these short labels. But also, I'm very aware too that when we think about objects in our galleries, that's only one moment in that object's life. And very often museums are engaged in sort of community outreach work with collections like that, where far more meaningful conversations will happen, and those conversations can be quite transformative. But I'm thinking of the objects as we see them when we go around the galleries, sort of in that sort of very artificial, you might say, environment of the museum space. When museums include such objects with barely any interpretation, this is a case of inclusion without engagement. Borrowing Sherry Turkle's idea of the fearful object, I suggest there is some individual and collective resistance to deep exploration of the material culture that can be used as evidence of practices that today we find abhorrent and possibly even shameful. The extent of that fearfulness is a factor of how close we are to the people, period, and the practice the object connects to. This is Jim Ray's jacket, which is on display in the Museum of Free Derry in Northern Ireland. Contemporary responses to the material culture of past traumas are shaped by the perception of the present-day consequence associated with the object. And here, consequence is understood as the capacity we think an object has to affect the present day. It is determined by the interplay of four key factors that give objects meaning: association, authenticity, place, and person. The first essential feature is association. The artifact must have a connection to past events that mark a time of trauma or distress. This includes, but goes beyond, what has been called difficult knowledge. Crucially, our response to the object goes from horror or repulsion to one in which we have a fear of the object. The object is, in its materiality and its evidence, presenting a present-day threat to the current situation. The second feature is authenticity. The fearful object is considered to be an authentic remnant of a period of trauma, and one with the ability to trigger a negative reaction, greater than that evoked by mere knowledge of events. This additional response is a result of how we experience the past through the encounter with the historic object in the present. In such a case, the materiality has an agency based upon the perception of truthfulness that can be associated with the object. Thirdly is the significance of place. Fearfulness changes with the location of an object, whether it is in the private space of the home where it can remain hidden, or placed on public display for the challenge it may represent others. So in Ireland, some of us are familiar with the story of the First World War death penny, which would be kept hidden in nationalist and republican homes because of the shame felt for having an ancestor who joined the British Army. Or more recently, as I was told by a survivor of the Troubles, the fearful object in his case were shoes disposed of before the amputee came home, for fear they would further emphasise his loss. Finally, we must think about the person viewing the object. Fearfulness is a product of the relationship between the person and what that object represents. An object that is fearful to one person can generate different responses for another. For instance, an object used in evidence in a crime is an opportunity for one person but damning for another. And we may think of this jacket sort of in the light of all of that. Each of the 4 factors named above are changed with display in the museum. In a museum context, authenticity is assumed, and the association between the object and the past moment is elucidated. The object is now on public view in a place of consequence and impact. The rarefied location of the glass case enhances the status of the object, and the notion of a museum as a place of authority is harnessed to tell a story with credibility. The cultural capital of the museum adds potency, and with that, the agency of the fearful object is potentially greater. A further factor of the museum space is the variation in context. The agency of a national museum or that of a local authority museum is different to that of a community museum. How a person makes meaning in response to the museum will depend on the individual's perceptions of the museum and its political purpose. And the meaning of an object can make will vary according to where it is displayed within the museum, how it is displayed, and what it is displayed alongside. So the object I want to think about is part of this project, and it's a project that was called Connection and Division, and it was a collecting project that was buying artefacts between the 1910 1930s period in Northern Ireland, and it was led by some local authority museums. And I was part of the team that was involved in this project. And this is really reflection on that project a number of years later. I think it's about 5 years later. So I'm just bringing that to you today. So the macrame bag here, it was just one of the objects that was purchased through this because the museum had recognised that it didn't really have very good collections that told the sort of the early 20th century history of Northern Ireland and the history of division in Northern Ireland. And there's quite a nice story to do with this bag. But the object that's the real focus of this paper is the Argenta autograph book. So this book was put on display, was purchased by this project, and then it was put on display for about a month in the exhibition, and then it's now in storage in the museum. So while this was on display, I am pretty sure that everybody just walked straight past it because it is a very ordinary looking autograph book. It's just very little and sort of brown cover, faded ink. So it's a sort of object you can just walk straight past without giving it a second glance. And this autograph book, the story behind it, it was compiled on a prison ship. And this prison ship was brought to Belfast in the 1920s. And for 2 years, people were sort of lifted from the streets, pulled from their beds, and about 700 men were incarcerated on this ship without trial. And the conditions on the ship were absolutely appalling. And there's only one history of the ship written, and it doesn't make easy reading for the conditions on the ship and the way people were treated. And also amongst the descendants of people who were on that ship, there's very little talked about it. And there was a book launch in 2001 of this book, and the coverage of the book launch talks about how families don't talk about their Argenta experiences. And given so much talked about the troubles in Northern Ireland, but this is one story that's not really passed down. And even amongst friends of mine from nationalist communities had not even heard of the Argenta ship. So there is a shame, and I don't know whether it's to do with just how people were treated and how people had to behave to survive on the ship. There were no cutlery, no plates. People would eat off the floor with their hands, that sort of thing. So the Argenta is a fragment of a story of national importance, and one that seems to reside in the shadows of our shared histories. So the detail of the period of the autograph book is difficult to engage with, whether privately and even more so in our national or local authority museums. We can touch on it, we can include it as we did in our exhibition, but only in such a way that we might walk straight past it, without barely a glance at the modest and unexceptional-looking autograph book. The inscriptions in the autograph book, which can then be linked to people's lives and through the history that has been written to what they experienced, could be described as a history that we in the mainstream do not routinely read about or acknowledge, which are the words of Mellor and Bretherton in reference to the histories of Black Australia. Once a person is imprisoned, we rarely engage with their experience, uncertain if we really want to know what people underwent, and not wishing to dwell upon our own responsibility. So this is a page from the book. I don't know if you want to read the inscription, it's quite hard to read. So the second object I want to talk about, which is quite different because it's in a different type of museum. So this is a letter which is on display in the Museum of Free Derry. And the Museum of Free Derry is an independent community museum. And this is a letter received by the family of a young man shot dead by the British Army in 1972. The author, without giving his name, writes to the parents on behalf of your enemies and signs off as the head of a paramilitary organisation. The letter suggests that their son was not murdered, he was happily killed because he was a terrorist. The author asks, may hell roast him? Your rebel bastards are doomed. It is displayed with no interpretation or context. Instead, it is presented as bold evidence of the intolerance of one community towards another. It is presented as beyond interpretation. It speaks for itself. So there's the label, which is beneath it. British Army and Loyalist reactions to Bloody Sunday. And I'll go back to the letter. Displayed as such, the letter is an advocate in the activist campaign for social justice, led by the body that founded the museum. Alongside the other iconic objects of the museum, a baby grow stained with blood, the jacket of a man shot in the back, as you've seen, and images of murdered children, a powerful narrative of injustice is constructed. It is an object that can be displayed in this museum, which is closely associated with Republican and nationalist communities. At this moment, the letter is not one which could be displayed in this manner, at least, in many other museums in Northern Ireland, in the shared spaces of national or local authority museums. So just some thoughts. Oh yeah, one more slide on this. This is a reaction I found online from a student visit who wrote a blog about their visit to the Museum of Free Derry. And this is John Kelly, who always, well, anytime I've been there and anytime I've brought groups of students there, starts his tour with a rubber bullet and then goes on to tell people that nails were put into the rubber bullet before it was shot to cause more damage. Now, this is something that they can do in that museum, but not very many other museums would do it. So some thoughts just to finish on the display of such objects. When tackling the display, there are many layers of considerations, from the nature of the institution of the museum to the social and political geography of the place, and linking to yesterday's keynote about the conflict spectrum, because obviously, Northern Ireland, and that was placed in a particular spot on the conflict spectrum, but there would be people in the same place who feel themselves in different places on that spectrum and who are hoping that other people are there with them in those other places. And that's where a lot of disillusionment can build up whenever you find out that there are people in different spots. So very often the objects associated with our troubled past, displayed in our publicly funded museums, are included without us interrogating the diversity and complexity of the histories they represent, and at least interrogating that in the displays. So this is inclusion without engagement, forging a narrative that maintains an uncritical community story. Boller, writing about the interpretation of the Holocaust, describes such presentations as easy reading, accounts that provided abdication of responsibility, leading to a voyeuristic pleasure of listening and judging the others from a position of power or safe distance. As we include objects without truly investigating the complexity of the histories, this is inclusion without engagement. Given the social and political context of Northern Ireland, perhaps there is a risk with engagement, Because of the fragile nature of the peace process in Northern Ireland, there is a fear that if we aren't careful, we will cause further division. There is a fear associated with revealing injustices or evidence of cruelty or brutality. These are pasts that are unsayable, which are the histories that are beyond the usual modes of public reconciliation or recollection. This is difficult knowledge, found at the margins and swept onto the carpet. And we are the reluctant publics, to quote our discussant today, who must be forced to confront horrific realities in which we may be somehow complicit. As well as other locations, that fear is managed within national cultural institutions. The museum is an invited space of authority and gravitas. Museums are highly structured and regulated spaces of public memory. On entering the museum, we are moving into a space that Susan Ashley referred to as a tightly controlled sites for engagement, where we don't risk losing control. In museums, our interpretation of the past is deliberately, sorry, that's my timer going off. Luckily, I'm about to finish. In museums, our interpretation of the past is deliberately chosen. It is a past that takes account more generally of the purposefulness of remembrance in public spaces, and specifically of the importance of the museum as a space of authority and influence. And just to finish, Lynch and Alberti, who are both sort of museum studies practitioners and writers, asked that the museum sector foster what they call radical trust, situations when authority is shared with and the museum has no control over either the product or the process. However, as they recognised in their project at Manchester Museum, working with communities on the subject of racism, the so-called shared space of the museum remains deeply political. So although the museum is a bounded space, it is also, I believe, and in the practice that you've heard already from Northern Ireland tells you, it is also a place of possibility and places we can think with. This process will be driven by innovative people working in and with museums and community groups, prepared to turn the fearful object into pioneering practice and change. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation, and thank you for this three wonderful talk. And now I would like to invite Professor Patterson to comment.
Well, thank you to our wonderful presenters for that rich range of papers that gives us quite a lot to think and to talk about. In looking across these diverse papers and thinking about the theme of this panel, Museums and Art for Critical Change, I have one main question that I wish to pose. And in fact, this is my question for the conference as a whole and captures my main response to the papers and panels that I've heard over the past few days. My question is, who is the presumed we that forms the foundation of our observations, recommendations, and critiques for museum practices in our various corners of the world? And I'd like to further disaggregate that question to consider it on at least three levels. First, who is the we that we are talking about in terms of museum production? This includes museum and gallery directors, curators, and staff, all of those involved in the making of exhibits, the display of objects, artwork, and narrative, and the epistemological and regulatory regimes of museum and galleries in all of their dimensions. Secondly, who is the we that is represented in museum and gallery content? Who and what are the subjects that are represented? Thirdly, who is the presumed audience that museums and galleries imagine they are speaking to? How can this audience be disaggregated, expanded, and diversified? So these seem like sort of obvious questions, I think, but I find that so often it seems like we jump into an analysis of the how content is displayed, museums are created, audiences are engaged, without really questioning deeply the presumed we that's at the heart of these foundations. So I'd like you to keep these questions in mind as I briefly consider them in relation to the three papers that have just been presented. In her paper on the critical museum, Katarzyna Muthesius-Murawska pays homage to the groundbreaking work of Piotr Piotrowski, who fought to expand museums and academics' understandings of what counted as art to include Eastern European art, for instance, and homoerotic representation in the history of art. And these were two domains that were long ignored in art exhibits and excluded from study at Western universities. Her paper made me think of my own personal experience being an art history major for about 2 months as an undergrad. And I can recall asking one of my professors about African art, and I was told that this was only a very recent phenomenon with a very small body of work, because historically Africans did not produce art, but only handicraft. And that, of course, will be a very familiar explanation for people working on indigenous art as well. Muthesius-Murawska explores the inherently classist and ethnocentric disciplining work of the museum. As, quote, instruments of power knowledge that, quote, serve as sites of acquisition of cultural capital and social norms, museums impose particular rules of conduct on their audiences, including how to become a proper museum visitor and art lover. As she argues, museums assume neutrality, but they have always served the ruling classes and kept changing their aims and identities alongside changes in the political system. Instead, she insists that the critical museum form part of a larger struggle for democracy and equality. This, of course, brought to mind for me the slogan, "Nothing about us without us." And the slogan originates, I believe, in Central European political traditions, but it has been taken up quite powerfully across the globe, especially by disability rights, indigenous rights activists, among others. In our second paper, for now I'm going to turn to Elizabeth Crooke's paper on the fearful object. Dr. Crooke dissects the main characteristics of material culture people find difficult or impossible to engage with. Association, authenticity, place, and the person viewing an artifact give objects their meaning. She warns against oversimplifying the complex histories of such objects, which lead to what she calls inclusion without engagement. But in working through this concept of the fearful object, the question of who is the we, I believe, must be asked at every stage along the way. So associations vary, as do criteria for authenticity and significance of place. And here I'm thinking of some of my own work at the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia in Big Rapids, Michigan, where one of the biggest challenges for the director and curator of that museum was that he couldn't assume a shared audience response that would react with a visceral negative reaction to a lot of the objects in his collection. So daily objects representing anti-Black caricatures. We can't assume that they have the same affective reception as we could with the image that Dr. Cook opened with, perhaps, of the forced feeding contraption. So I would suggest that the persons viewing such objects be considered as actually quite foundational to the other dimensions of a fearful object's meaning. So there's a tendency to approach stories of suffering with the sense that they are difficult because they contain subject matter that is painful, tragic, or gruesome. And as Erica Lara and I wrote a few years ago, less attention is typically paid to the problems inherent in the transmission of such stories. And some of these challenges include that they are inevitably mediated, perspectival, and often contested. So educational theorists Alice Pitt and Deborah Britzman's notion of difficult knowledge, which has been brought up in several panels, shifts this locus of difficulty, asking us to look beyond the subject matter itself toward the audiences receiving it. As opposed to the easily assimilated, lovely knowledge of comfortable truths, difficult knowledge induces a breakdown of interpretive certitude and reified notions of identity, forcing audiences to confront unfamiliar perspectives, unsettling and disarming them, and thus opening new spaces for learning, understanding, growth, and change. So it's not just the traumatic or painful material that comes out of violent histories that makes knowledge difficult, but it's the fact that that difficulty is so unevenly dispersed. Here, the example I always offer to my students is that when I grew up in the United States, Thanksgiving was one of my favorite holidays. I was taught by my public school system the romanticized white supremacist and deeply violent lies that this day celebrated the so-called discovery and foundation of America by pilgrims who were welcomed by either an unclaimed, empty landscape or friendly natives. And it wasn't until I got into university that I learned that our day of family celebration and gastronomic overindulgence is grieved by many indigenous people across the Americas as a day of genocide. So how do we contend with this multiplicity and divergence of meaning that exists in seemingly every corner, in so many objects at sites of conflicted history? Ciraj Rassool has much to offer us in his complex analysis of the forced removals, art, and social practice in Cape Town's District 6. It's worth noting that I didn't say the District 6 Museum because Dr. Rassool is looking more broadly at a range of activities, actors, and sites in order to, quote, extend our understanding of the emergence and development of the District 6 Museum and the complex and contested nature of its memory work. In so doing, he presents a highly nuanced and complex view of the shifting and varied knowledge relations between a range of actors. And these include artists, artworks, thinking about the agency of art itself, District 6 memory projects, museum workers, community members, and visitors. What we get from this is an in-depth exploration of the connections between aesthetics and politics and the complex domain of the ethics of representation. In laying out the history of District 6, sketching out the broader political and cultural context, and examining three different but intersecting and related artistic engagements with the forced removals of the neighborhood's residents, Rassool goes far and deep in answering my opening question about who is the we. And I would also argue that he pushes us even further to consider a crucial set of related questions. And these include who benefits from these representations? To whom do these representations actually belong? Who has the right, the power, and the possibility to recontextualize, to move, and to market the suffering of others? And I think with that, I will close and open the floor to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we have time for discussion. I would like to invite our panelists to the stage. All members of panel. And before opening floor for discussion, I would like to ask our speakers if they want to comment, to answer Professor Patterson. No.
I just want to say that it's a very good question. This is one of those questions that actually museum studies grapple with have been grappling with for a long time. Who is the we, isn't it? So, we've been trying to offer various. Actually, all our papers talked about certain we's. I focus on bodies, actually, no, I haven't got, actually, at the moment, I haven't got anything more enlightening to add to this question.
Okay, we have 3 fascinating talks, and they open really, they raise a lot of issues. So, any question? Yeah, Erika, please. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for that panel. It was excellent. This is a question for Ciraj. I appreciated very much your critique of Sue Williams' work. Williams or Williamson? Yeah, Williamson's work. And this question of appropriation, commodification. And I just wondered if you could imagine if the District 6 Museum could now create an exhibition that would raise these very questions that you address, because I think that would be extraordinarily useful.
We have another question here. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question for Katarzyna, and the question is, I agree that the museums should do this work. They should be critical, and they should concentrate on neglected minorities, whether social, national, or LGBT or else. But the question for me is, is this really social responsible? And I will explain it. If there is no another problem that we then neglect the majority, and that we just leave the master narrative, the nation narrative, to others, to non-liberal nationalists. So the question is, it's enough to be just critical, and how much we should be also like not just critical but cultivating museum, the constructive museum, the museum building positive master major narratives. Thank you.
And there is also another question. Yeah,
I have a question. One of the things that all of your talks brought up for me was just how much we think of the museum as some kind of a vessel for ideas, a vessel for communication, for heritage, whatever. But the museum itself seems to be the most problematic object, the most difficult object of anything that it might potentially contain. That the structure and the body of the museum it needs to be interrogated, perhaps even more so than anything we might have. And we often do that in organizations through our public programs. And as we increasingly emphasize learning and participatory models for engagement or prioritizing them even over a straightforward curatorial practice. I wonder if you can talk maybe a little bit about that and the construction of the museum, because I feel like we're ever creating a situation where we want to almost like nesting eggs, like Russian nesting dolls, where we just keep wanting to enclose and capture the essence of a museum in a way that it can be distilled into something that we can engage with ourselves as professionals, but also provide platforms for the public to engage in. And we often use the public space outside of a museum in order to affect that perspective and really physically offer people a chance to look critically at the walls of the organization. And I wonder whether the architecture of museums itself is something that we've been under-critical of. Frank Lloyd Wright's upside-down ziggurat of the Guggenheim was really completely different and changed, and was the introduction of contemporary art on a par with the classical and with the masters of Western art. And maybe we've maybe lost a little bit of an ability to criticize our structures and our institutions. And so maybe I wonder if you could talk about that, and also maybe the structure of museums as management organizations, and how we can maybe change these sorts of things. I think that the very, I don't want to say chaotic, but not organized in the traditional sense approach of the District 6, I think is quite interesting and quite exciting. And yet at the same time, we have the practicalities of environmental controls and humidity and registration and paperwork and that sort of thing.
And last question for this round, please.
Yeah, it connects to the other questions. Thank you for 3 excellent papers. Also, there is more and more art about migration, for example. I mean, trying to be an activist for a group which is traditionally not represented in the White Cube. I think particularly of Bushra Khalili's work. And there is a tension between what the panelists said about activist art, appropriation, but her work maybe tries to give voices to those who are affected, but at the same time the White Cube is very sterile and maybe does not reach out to who? I mean, the we, who's the we, who's the audience? And is it really only directed, or is it maybe a platform, I think Elizabeth took it up, where you have also a freedom of reflection? If you could say more about this, maybe it would be great.
So now it's time for you. So
Okay.
probably this.
All right. So I understand that I have one question, a kind of major question, but then I will reconnect with you answering other questions. So whether museum should be just critical or whether it should actually produce master narratives. That was the gist of your question, as I understand. So in my opinion, critique nowadays is in a way master narrative. So whatever, it was Raymond Williams who said about those residual, imagined, and assimilated, or there was another term. So I believe in the imagines, I believe in critique, critique which produces, which stirs the field, which has got the chance to realign the field. And this critique is the master narrative of the time. This is how. Of course, you may disagree, and I'm very, very interested in actually taking the discussion further. But just to say, to invite the immigrants, to invite immigrants. You may say that this is. That you would not consider as critique, but as a master narrative, is it? Right.
By master narratives, I was just trying to say that if you just criticize something, so you leave the rest, let's say the national narrative, the national history, or the national arts, whatever, to others, to non-liberal nationalists, for example, for different kinds of politicians, people who actually say the narrative very loudly, and it's not true that the critic is today's master narrative. There is plenty of nationalism around us, everywhere. Donald Trump is not the critic. The critical man, but he is defining the master narrative of US nowadays. So the question is whether if we leave to producing the positive image, the cultivating of the old narratives to others, and we just criticize, if we are doing a good job for the society. That's the question.
Well, I would still, obviously, in my opinion, we should criticize Donald Trump rather than approving of his master narratives. I cannot envisage. I would not encourage any museum to provide a master narrative which would say that to show the American, that for instance the kind of slogan of the American museums would be to show that America, whatever was his slogan, It was something about America is going to get no, American people should know. Pardon? Make America great again. I wouldn't like to see that as a master narrative. And if you say, I mean, I understand, and of course that was one of the critiques that we have encountered, that you have to provide, that the museum addresses the you know, many people of various beliefs and so on. So you have to produce exhibitions for everybody. And this is partly true and partly not. I mean, okay, so we can produce ars homoerotica and other critical exhibitions about democracy, and apart from that, doing the business as usual and to celebrate the national geniuses. Perhaps, but this is a matter for discussion. I suppose that that this celebration of national geniuses could be done in a slightly different way, in a self-critical way. And I am against the master narratives. I believe that actually critique is the master narrative of our time.
Yeah, some very useful, interesting issues and challenges that have come up. I mean, you know, at the time that the Streets exhibition was being prepared, Sue Williamson certainly approached the District 6 Museum Foundation and said, I would like to display my installations in the museum, as if the museum was creating a venue for the display of art. And I suppose it might even have been an offer. I don't know whether she wanted the museum to purchase the work at the time. But I remember she got told, well, you know, sorry, but this is not that kind of museum. She certainly wasn't coming to the museum to seek some kind of relationship so that she could work with, and because she was, I mean, what she was essentially doing was she was collecting shards from the rubble, and then she was placing them into perspex that were then displayed in an installation of light with this soundscape, in which the shard of life lived in District 6 was kind of turned into fragments of a display of itself. And, you know, I mean, of course, what she did had value in a certain kind of way. She's an artist with a right to practice her art. And she has, I mean, she has thought about the evolution of her District 6 work in a very critical way. Later on, she did participate in a sculpture festival with other artists that was curated by the District 6 Museum on the landscape itself. And so, you know, it's an ongoing conversation. Of course, the most commoditized form of her work that got donated to the Ibrahim family, I think they have donated it to the District 6 Museum. So it's in the District 6 Museum collection. And so there is every chance that one day that might in some way feature in. But, you know, in museums and collecting institutions of this time, of this kind, are periodically really challenged around their sustainability. And I mean, one similar collecting institution in Johannesburg, for its sustainability, has now turned to arranging an auction of struggle posters, you know, where you have a transformation of that one colleague, late colleague, has referred to a process of transfer from weapon to ornament. You know, where things change. But, you know, one has to admit, just coming to the challenges that Monica has put forward about what disciplining work the museum does. Of course, the work of the District 6 Museum happens in relation to a very contested landscape of land restitution and commercial development. And quite frankly, the forces of property are such that they are seeking to limit the meaning of District 6 to some kind of land restitution theme park in ultimately what is a very lucrative market in land values in downtown land that, where the private land and commercial concerns are going to take over. And so what the District 6 Museum's work does is it contests the meaning of that land, and it suggests that this history of removal should be the main way in which the land is to be interpreted, and that land restitution is not just land as property, but it's land as landscape. And so, these are very difficult things, but at the same time, quite frankly, the District 6 Museum, its work, as radical as it is also making the land and its people governable. It is presenting a certain kind of governmentality to how things should turn out in District 6 and beyond, other urban and rural landscapes of removal, so that a certain kind of meaning can be given to land restitution. Of course, we talk about the critical citizens and all of that, but it is still an orderly citizen who is turned into a subject of the state. And so, of course, the museum is involved in that. Now, the thing about, not to go on too long, the thing about District 6 is that these struggles are not over. Because right now, you have a technical university that has built a student dormitory on top of this land of removal, doing complete violence to the meaning of that land. Now, these are ongoing struggles, and as much as the work of the museum is geared towards mobilizing ex-residents and land claimants into a movement of memory politics, it is also at the same time making that land governable. So it's in a sense it's assisting the state in some way.
Thank you, Ciraj. That was great points there. And I think just to take up your last point about making people governable, like in Northern Ireland, it's the shared future agenda, living together, government agenda, and there is a certain amount of lead being given to cultural institutions to contribute to the programme for government. And like in my role in Northern Ireland Museums Council, we have to give evidence that we are contributing to the programme for government, even though we're supposed to be an arm's length body. But so there is a sense, and there are cases, and William, who works in National Museums Northern Ireland, could probably speak better on this, on sort of pressures put on the museum for not interpreting objects in a certain way, or giving more interpretation that leans towards the community of that minister who's putting the pressure on the museum. So there's that sort of pressures put on them. And then, you think of the Argenta prison book, what place does that object play in creating a governable people? And as soon as you start to expose the deep histories of this object, it becomes really tricky because, as you said in your response, the difficulty of objects is not evenly dispersed. For some people, that prison book is an opportunity to prove a point and to demonstrate how they were treated, and for other people it is something they don't want talked about because it's it is there, we could be complicit in that treatment, and exposing our complicity is not something we want to do. So where an object like that fits, and indeed, although I was involved in the museum, in the team that displayed that object then, you know, I'm still in conversation with the curator of what are we going to do with it now? You know, can we move on? Can we do community engagement with this object? Who do we need to buy into it? Will a local authority, council, who with a mixed political range of people agree to their funded museum digging too deeply with this object? And I think that's, you know, when you're asking who is the we, you know, it is just so messy who the we are, because, you know, the we is as much the team doing the interpretation, the audience in all its complexity, and also Dominique's point, which I think is a great one about the museum as a vessel, and maybe that is the most problematic dynamic. And you know, it is you know, what does it mean to do something in public? You know, you can do what you want in privacy of your home, possibly, but you know, as soon as you do something in the public sphere, a different collection of sort of ethics come into play, and different sort of moral responsibilities, and people are harnessing the notion of the museum. Like, I think it's quite fascinating that we can sort of talk about museum histories, we can talk about the powerful dynamic of the museum, and yet we still want them. You know, they still have a resonance, they still have a power, and we still, from the diversity of backgrounds and like, why do, you know, the community activist groups that I look at, you know, I'm sitting looking at Facebook groups that are sort of activist Facebook groups who then put on exhibitions and then collect artifacts and do these like, why are they doing museum stuff? You know, but anyway, I'll stop there.
I think everyone has given some great responses.
But there was a question about architecture as an agent, which we didn't refer to. And yes, no, I fully believe that architecture has got a great potential, but to what extent architecture has got this magic potential of bringing in the bodies that have not, that are not museum goers, that I am slightly skeptical about whether architecture itself could do it. Yeah.
I don't think architecture is like an answer. I just think we tend to be very undercritical of architecture and bringing architecture to bear with the questions that we have, the difficult questions we ask ourselves. We don't necessarily keep our just as rigorous with them eventually.
Yes, but you did say that Guggenheim Museum, it was fantastic architecturally, aesthetically, you know, and from, you know, all kinds of visual aspects. However, did it really bring other public into the museum? The entry is $20, as far as during my last visit. You know, it's just not didn't work.
We have a wonderful case in the Eastern Cape of you know, in some ways museum has also become a stage in the toolkit of transitional justice. You know, the stuff that I write and my colleagues write about museum as process, that the transitional justice people love that, because then they turn that into a kind of, you know, an administration and a bureaucracy, and the museum is also a means by which the state wants to be seen to be delivering to the public. And in the Eastern Cape, we have a wonderful example of a fantastic amount of money that was made available through a city partnership between Port Elizabeth and a Swedish city, where the entire budget was spent on a world-class architect to make a museum in a township. But this is a museum without content. It was a museum as a building, and it was a museum that failed, that spent all the money on an award-winning building. And so, you know, architecture is a necessary element in the equation, but it cannot provide the concept of the museum?
Maybe I just add something, because I did have a thought. So, I mean, for me, I work on community-based museums for whom even getting a room has often been a struggle and nothing to take for granted. So I would just say that just as the difficulty of difficult knowledge is unevenly dispersed, resources are as well. So if we think of the Bilbao effect on one end of the spectrum, there are also many museums that are existing in collected items in people's basements and cardboard boxes for decades in some cases before they even get a physical room to be housed in. So it really varies.
Thank you. Let's open for another round of questions, please. Yes.
Is it working? Yeah. I have a question for Ciraj, pretty much reflecting his own question he posed yesterday, sort of provoking. You framed your piece as the ethics of activist art, and I would provoke you if it's actually art you're dealing with. It seems to me that right from the outset, once again, the categorical stuff, it seems to limit the terrain of multi-layered social practice. You really try to understand in a very specific urban setting with a very specific history, and by framing it as art right from the outset, you seem to aestheticize it out of that very concrete setting. So to me, what you propose to us, the notion of inscription, seems to me way more promising and potentially leading to a way of understanding political practice as an inscription which might assume aesthetic qualities if I, for example, don't have access to other means. And it seems to me what is at the heart of the response of the artist you're dealing with reference to the wall. You know, if I'm not part of parliament, if I don't have access to other written resources, I just inscribe my political attitude, opinion in a different way, which shouldn't be reduced to art at all. So I almost think that your piece, what you describe here to us, is really feeding into a reconfiguration of political theory.
Another question? Remarks? No, so please.
I have one.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Another one. Sorry.
I just had a quick question for Katarzyna. That alongside the development of the critical museum in Poland has, of course, also been the development of critical theatre practices. And to some extent, they've preceded the critical museology. And they've also thought about themselves as sites of power, of national community building. They've contested Polish artistic canons. So I was wondering to what extent you see the critical museum and the critical theatre in relationship to one another, and whether or not they're generating the same kind of publics or very different critical publics.
Okay. So, all right. So, to say the truth, as far as I know, of course, it was Piotr's concept, and I actually joined him only. But as far as I know, his concept was not related to the actions of critical theatre. By critical theatre, do you mean Grotowski and Gardzienice, or do you mean something else? Right. Okay. So, this is also difficult for me to answer because I don't know. I have to say that I'm not that familiar with the Polish critical theatre now. I live in England, so it simply didn't enter my kind of paradigm. So it is, in a way, of course, I can try to answer this question using various words, but I just feel that it will be simply unfair on my part, to answer this question. Let's have a discussion about it later. You will tell me more about the critical theatre. Maybe I know more about it than I think at the moment, and then and then it will be interesting for me, in a way, to connect the concept of the critical museum to the critical. But the only one thing I worried was that you say that the critical theater is involved in the creation of the national identity. And this is definitely the National Museum, the critical museum is actually deconstructing the concept of the museum as the fixer of the national identity, wants to include the others, you know, the refugees, immigrants, so minorities, and so minorities, I suppose they have been included into the audiences of the critical theater, but anyway, we have to discuss it in detail.
I agree with you. You know, there was a time in the first 10 years or so of after 1994, members of the board were very interfering. We were a board that were the guardians of the story of District 6. It was an activist board, and we were involved in the very practice of making the museum in an ongoing way. And I always used to say to Peggy that, you know, I don't have an artistic bone in my body. And she used to, you know, fight with me and challenge me. And, you know, it was just so wonderful to be among people like Peggy Delport and Tina Smith, who were engaged in doing aesthetic acts all the time that, quite frankly, got masked and hidden away into the beauty and into the look and feel of the District 6 Museum as a curated space. But I'm trying to say that, in fact, it involved very particular ideas about art and about the relationship between art and society, and between aesthetics and politics, and you know, this is very much Peggy Delport's work that resulted in certain kinds of work like murals and frescoes, and quite frankly, in the exhibitions, Streets and Digging Deeper, which in some ways are Peggy Delport installations. But she would never say that. And, you know, it's also interesting to contrast those with the work of artists that also depicts District 6 lives and that end up in a museum as part of a collection, or that get sold on the market, or that get displayed in a biennale. So I'm quite interested in that kind of cultural economy and the contradictions of representing District 6 in these very different kinds of spaces. And I mean, of course, these are ongoing debates, and my own work has kind of resisted the idea of the autonomous artist, and favors the collaborative methods. But yeah, thank you so much for your question.
Thank you very much. We're over time, so I would like to thank our speakers once again for excellent talks that make the discussion so interesting. Thank you for being here, and invite all of us for lunch. Okay, and sorry, one word more.
Just one small little announcement. I promise it's not an advertisement. I had a book published with two of my colleagues literally a couple of days ago. I've only just seen, and I managed to get the publisher and the European distributor to give a discount to members of this conference, and there are pamphlets outside for this book called Unsettled History. Thank you.
Thank you.